History Month. Really this goes back even post emancipation, just as Memorial Day was initiated by newly emancipated people to honor soldiers who had fought for their freedom. As soon as Abraham Lincoln was killed, memorials began to spring up among emancipated people to celebrate his life on his birthday. And as soon as probably the loudest spokesman and the most photographed person in the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, who had famously written in his autobiography of his escape from the horrific condition of enslavement, and become one of the greatest orators of the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. When he died, then newly emancipated people began to celebrate his birthday. Both of their birthdays happened to coincide with the month of February. And so Carter G. Woodson, who is a PhD graduate in history from Harvard, decided to, organize what was already happening at a grassroots level around the country when he founded in 1915 an organization called the Association for the Study, what was then known as Negro Life and History, which is now known as the Association for the Study of African Life and History, African American Life and History. And so this group, ASALH, around 1915, started to try to organize and sort of be a clearinghouse space for thematic celebration of the achievements of African Americans post enslavement in the emancipated era through Reconstruction up until that point. So over those first 20, 30 years, it was a more informal process that was galvanized by this group, ASALH, led by Carter G. Woodson and other people who worked with ASALH. Around 1925, Woodson organized what would be then known as Negro History Week in the month of February. And so it became colloquially known as, this is celebrating the births of two people who fought for African American emancipation. We know that that's much more complicated when we think about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's valorized sort of freeing the slaves, but we know it's more complicated than that. And this is not history class, but that's an imprecise statement. He did sign the Emancipation Proclamation after a great deal of pressure and negotiation. But he is the president who, ostensibly signed that into law. So he's lauded for that. And so that month of February began to be the space for celebrating what was then formalized decades later as Black History Month. And so now we have this month of February that coincides with the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln to mark the achievements of African Americans throughout, really, I would say, since even before the inception of the nation. If we're starting to look at some enslaved people like Lucy Terry Prince, who I study as a scholar of literature, who was documenting in her poetics in the 1740s the activism and the lives of people like herself. So, but yes, so it's been formally marked by the nation, which kind of co-opted in the 1960s or so, in formalizing, acknowledging, I should say, what African-American people have been doing since the 1920s under the direction of Carter G. Woodson, who was a historian who decided that it would be inspiration to younger generations to understand and have a space and time to remember what their ancestors had gone through, what they had achieved, and what was possible because of what had been done in the past.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Wilson, we are in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. What are your recommendations for how people can celebrate Black History Month virtually this year?
Well, ASALH actually is having a virtual event. So you can go to asalh.org/festival, and you can look up the virtual Black History Month Festival that is the official festival of ASALH, the organization that Woodson founded. Events started on the 1st. Tonight, there's an actual conversation with Mae Jemison, who is one of the pioneers in astronomy and an astronaut, African-American woman, one of the first to go out into space. There's a conversation with Carla, the famous chef from the show that was on ABC. I'm forgetting the name in this moment, later in the week. The major marquee event is with Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham on the 20th of February. And so there's a whole list of events on their website that are virtual events that one can attend if you want to participate in the national kind of formal events that the organization has. What I'm doing personally in this time of COVID is to really think through and honor, as a Black person, the people who are heroes in my life. My grandmother, whose name was Mary Elizabeth Long Wilson, who is not going to be in anybody's history book, who was a first in many ways in her family and our community. I grew up in a small town in North Florida called Mariana. And she and her husband, my grandfather, did some things that nobody had ever done. And they made it possible for me to be here before you talking about this. So I would say to all people, especially Black folk, but I would say to all who really want to participate in that, is to really investigate the histories and the historiography of the communities in which you grew up, and find out the gaps there. You know, who are the people who were the first post office workers, and who are the people who were the first to be elected on the school board in your area, and how are they being honored or remembered in your communities? If they're not being honored or remembered, we have the internet now. You have the ability to go on your social media and say, hey, y'all, did you know that in 1966 or whatever, this thing happened? So much of that doesn't make it into the history books. It's important to remember Frederick Douglass. He's a remarkable man. It's important to also know who Ella Baker was. You know, he's a organizer, political organizer who doesn't get enough attention. So yes, we need to know these famous names that we know or that we might have been exposed to, but it's also important to educate ourselves about our own communities, our own families, and find ways to let the world know that Black people have been here since the inception, before the inception of this country. Always, I would argue, sometimes more than the people who formally got credit for founding it, trying to make it a more perfect union, always trying to have it living up to the ideals that it says that it believes in so fervently and so passionately, pointing out the hubris, pointing out the inconsistencies and the outright lies and the abuses of power, always moving toward more equality, more parity, more equity, more honesty, with with more circumspection. And so find the people in your life, find the people in your community, and then of course nationally, globally, find ways to let other people know about the truth of the people who have paved the way for us all to be where we are. And particularly in the midst of COVID, it is important for us to take care, to be respectful of other space, to take care, to protect ourselves and others, while communities of color are disproportionately being harmed by this virus. Wearing a mask and washing our hands is not ahistorical. It is actually timely. It is actually something that can save lives. And so that's what I would say in the midst of COVID, is to really take care of oneself and to be mindful of ways to respectfully care for others, in the context of COVID. That's what I would say about that.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for all that beautifully said, those words, and thank you for joining us live here on NewsNOW from Fox.
That's it? That was fast. Okay.
Yes,
I do want to say something before I go. A lot of people want to mark these firsts during Black History Month, and it's always a very fraught thing for me. There's a beautiful essay by someone I'm grateful to call a friend, Imani Perry, that's on the New York Times, about this idea of making heroes and the problematics of that. these Black heroes. And I'm very proud of the achievements of Kamala Harris, of being of being who she is and the historic role that she's in. But we need to know who Charlotte Ray was, who was the first Black woman to pass the bar, who was a graduate of Howard University, just like Kamala Harris. And if we can decenter this idea of looking for individual messiahs or individual people to valorize and to look up to as sort of like the one who was the first to do something, and we can start to again pay attention to the continuum that Kamala Harris happens because of the success that Charlotte Ray had as a lawyer, graduating from Howard, and all that she did in the 1870s, 1890s, 1880s as the first woman of color lawyer in this country, also paving the way for, we could go on and on listing people. Like I said, Ella Baker, there's so many people who politically got in the way, Shirley Chisholm. There are just so many people who made the way for Kamala Harris to happen. And as long as we allow our history to decenter that continuum, to understand that movements are really, honestly, the best movements, the most successful ones are leaderless, are ones in which strong people, groups of people working together toward an end, achieve something. There was a whole mass of people who went out to vote to make sure that Kamala Harris could represent our country as the vice president. And so I just think it's important at this time that we shift our relationship to Black History Month, that we shift our relationship to this concept of American exceptionalism, that, I would say we're more like the children of Israel wandering around in the desert for 40 years trying to get at this ideal of the promised land than this idea that we are the promised land, that we've somehow arrived, that we are the nation that, is somehow better than every other nation. The more that we continue to tell that untruth to ourselves, the more that we refuse to look at our pockmarks and our fault lines, the more that we allow these messianic leaders who can sometimes lead people astray, lead people to their own demise, as we saw happen at the Capitol just a few weeks ago, when a whole group of people who happened to mostly look the same way thought that they had a Messiah who would call them out to take their country back. And now they're dealing with the consequences of that, and our country is dealing with the consequences of that. When we valorize Martin Luther King Jr., who was an amazing human being, and not talk about Bayard Rustin, who happened to be a Black gay man, openly Black gay man, who was his right-hand person, who organized the March on Washington in 1963, who had organized with Asa Philip Randolph and others in the 1940s, what would become the march in 1963, and had threatened to do that march in the 1940s, which led to the integration of the military. When we just only focus on Martin Luther King Jr. and not talk about all these people working together in this movement that took 30, 40 years to get to where it got, to get the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, that's now been, gutted and doesn't even exist anymore and has not been formally recreated. And when we don't demand that continuum to be taught, we allow the Voting Rights Act to be taken away. We allow all these laws that are being put into place that disenfranchise voters. We allow ourselves to have this collective amnesia and forget that progress, Frederick Douglass said this beautifully, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so when we allow ourselves to only focus on the first, Kamala Harris, and think of her as some kind of great achievement, we've arrived, we've done this thing, see how progressive we are, see how we're integrating, we're doing things, we're moving forward. We allow these fake markers of progress to kind of distract us from looking at our actual aims and goals that we have set out in our Constitution and the ways that we're not living up to them. Yes, Black History Month is beautiful, it's important, it's necessary to remember these people who met these benchmarks. But it's a real challenge for me, and I think for Imani Perry and other people who are talking about this now in the public sphere, that we use this month to pretend that we have somehow achieved at some exceptional American ideal that we have not achieved. People are dying from COVID, mostly Black and brown people, indigenous communities are being affected. White supremacists just stormed the Capitol, led by a person who told them that they should stand by and stand back, and then activated them at the appointed time. And so we really have to look ourselves in the mirror as a nation and celebrate these individuals who did amazing things. And I will always do that. I grew up doing it. I've always been a person who studied my history, both national and personal. And I encourage young people to do that, young adults, whatever level you are, to do that. But it's also important to put up a mirror to the truth of our ideals and tell ourselves the truth about why we haven't achieved them. And I think this time, with the theme this month being Black families, I forgot to say that earlier. The theme from Asala is the focus on the Black family, but I would say Black families because Black communities are not monoliths. Say the Black community is problematic. The Black family to me is problematic. But Black families are at a state of, I think, in many ways, activating and organizing, having to get through this pandemic, but also are in other ways very vulnerable and in a state of crisis because of situations like the Moynihan Report that happened in 1964 that basically discussed the welfare state in a certain kind of stereotypical way that still persists in this mythology around Black folks and the welfare system and poverty in our country and the causes of that. Not looking at the systemic racism that's behind it, but abjecting it onto these certain kinds of mothers who are profligate, who have all these different children, children with different fathers, these lies about Black communities and Black families that get perpetuated mostly by people who identify with a kind of conservatism in government and using that as a way to like limit resources for Black families. And that leads to the systemic cycle that I'm telling you about of these inequities. And so I think it's important for us right now, as we talk about Black families during this Black History Month virtual moment that Asala is asking us to initiate, that we begin to think about the people in your community, wherever you are, who have embraced. It's always, I always find like it's always these Black, selfless Black women and men who are feeding people when there's no food, when the stimulus checks are running out. You see them being honored on some television show on, Kelly and Ryan or Good Morning America or these different programs, people who sometimes have very little themselves sacrificing. And so how in this month can those people be celebrated, honored right now at the same time that we are honoring the Frederick Douglasses, the Kamala Harrises, whoever, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, my personal heroes. I'm a poet, so I'm thinking about the writers that I look up to. As we honor these names, these famous names that we know, how can we honor the people in our larger families or communities who are sacrificing every day to look after their core as an extended family. I think that is a very African-American posture to sort of think not just about me and myself and my own individual comfort, but to think about how can my position of privilege, of opportunity, whatever, make space for somebody else to have it a little bit easier. So honoring those people as a part of the larger community, honoring those Black family members, I think is an important posture that I would challenge anybody, wherever you are on the political spectrum, to try to do in this month, and then let that manifest into March, April, May, June, July. Every month should be Black History Month. Every month is, whether we acknowledge it or not, Black History Month. There is no American history without Black folks. The first shot in the Revolutionary War was shot by first person to die in the Revolutionary War was a Black man, Crispus Attucks. So, Black people have been sacrificing themselves, sometimes I think unduly, and to their own demise, for the ideals of this nation from its inception. And it is incumbent for us to not put into the month of February only this focus on honoring our Black heroes, as it were, and heroines. All right, I'm sorry.
Exactly.
I won't ramble on anymore. I know you have other things to do.
And no, that was all beautifully said. Exactly. Honoring not just historic heroes, but local heroes, and, honoring Black History Month every month of the year. Well, thank you, Dr. Wilson from Florida State University. Thank you so much for joining us here on News Now from Fox. We so appreciate this insight.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody, heading back out.